When I first saw my husband bringing his nephew into the house with buckets of paint and a toolbox, I didn't think much of it. "It's just for a few weeks," he said. "We'll fix the upstairs, repaint the hallway, maybe finally repair the back door." I nodded. I always nodded. That's what wives do when their husbands make plans that don't involve them. But it wasn't until the third evening, when I came down the stairs and saw them laughing over crooked floorboards, that something inside me shifted. There was a lightness in the way they moved, the way his nephew looked around the house like it had secrets. I didn't feel threatened, I felt unseen. And then came the night my husband left for the city on business. He kissed me on the cheek like he had for years, not really seeing me. And I watched the car disappear into the dusk. The house was quiet after. Too quiet. I stood by the window, not knowing then that this silence would echo in me louder than anything else. I didn't know that I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. That the wood I'd step on tomorrow would creak under a weight heavier than footsteps. 3 months ago, I made a choice. A choice I'm still paying for. But before you judge me, before you assume you know what kind of woman I am, let me tell you everything. Let me tell you what really happened in that house. And while you listen, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer honestly, have you ever felt so invisible that doing the wrong thing felt like the only way to feel real again? He said it would be just for the summer. "We'll finally fix that place," he told me, referring to the house we hadn't visited in over a decade. The house where his parents once lived, then slowly died, first from illness, then from neglect. "We'll clean it up, repaint everything, maybe flip it eventually. Good for both of us." He said both, but he meant himself. He always did. I'd stopped correcting him years ago. The drive up was long and uneventful. He didn't ask how I was doing. He talked about market value, floor plans, and how his nephew, the one I barely remembered meeting at our wedding, would be joining us next week to help out. "He's good with tools, better than I am," he chuckled. I smiled at the windshield. I had nothing to add. The house looked the same, only more tired. The white paint peeled like sunburned skin. The wooden porch sagged a little more. Inside, it smelled of dust and old linen. Memories clung to the corners, his mother's sewing chair, the faded wallpaper in the hallway, the uneven steps we always meant to fix. We started cleaning the next morning. He assigned tasks with military precision. He'd handle the attic and the electricals. I could clean the living room and maybe box up the old dishes. "Just don't move anything heavy," he said, not looking up. As if I wasn't used to carrying weight. On the third day, his nephew arrived. He came in through the back, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a sleeveless shirt and a soft, curious smile. His eyes lingered a second longer than necessary when I greeted him. I told myself I imagined it. "She's in charge when I'm not around," my husband joked. The nephew nodded and said, "Got it," but he looked at me, not him. That afternoon, I scrubbed the kitchen tiles until my fingers ached. From the living room, I could hear them laughing, dropping tools, arguing about measurements. There was something familiar in their rhythm, the way men sound when they forget you're in the next room. My husband didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't notice the way I lingered near the doorway, pretending to check on progress. I just wanted to be part of the noise. That night, I sat on the porch alone. The crickets were loud, the wood beneath me warm from the afternoon sun. He sat beside me eventually, drink in hand. We didn't talk much. He asked what I thought of the paint samples. I told him the beige was too sad. He shrugged. "It sells," he said. "Like everything else." The next morning, I woke early. He was already gone, driven to the hardware store, probably, or into town for cell reception. I wandered through the rooms, barefoot, careful not to trip on the paint cans. The nephew was in the backyard, shirtless, sawing down old branches. He looked up when I stepped out with coffee. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough with sleep. I nodded, held out the second mug. Our fingers brushed. He didn't pull away quickly. After breakfast, we worked in the hallway. I stripped the wallpaper while he sanded the banister. The air smelled like glue and wood dust. At one point, he offered to get me a better mask. "It's probably not safe," he said. I shrugged. "I've breathed worse." "You okay doing this?" he asked suddenly. "All this work?" I looked at him. His brow furrowed in a way that didn't seem condescending. Just genuine. No one had asked me that in years. "I like it," I said. And I did. The sweat, the effort, the ache, it made me feel present. Later that day, my husband returned. He talked about fixtures and insulation. He didn't ask what we'd accomplished. He didn't notice that the walls were already bare, or that the nephew had fixed the porch step. That evening, we had dinner on paper plates. The three of us. My husband went on about market trends. The nephew listened politely, but every now and then, I felt his eyes drift toward me. Once, I looked back. Just briefly. That night, I stood by the mirror in the guest bathroom. I'd cleaned it earlier, the glass no longer foggy with age. I took off my earrings. Touched my cheek. I looked tired. But there was something else too. A flicker in the eyes. Like a pilot light, waiting. I remembered the way his eyes lingered. The sound of his voice when he asked if I was okay. I remembered the softness of his fingers when they touched mine, fleeting, but real. I told myself I was being ridiculous. And yet, when I went to bed, I left the hallway door open. Just a little. Just enough to hear footsteps if they came. The morning started slowly, as if even time hesitated. My husband had already left early, some meeting in town, something about insulation and supplier delays. He kissed me on the cheek, said he wouldn't be back until evening, and was gone before I fully opened my eyes. The bed beside me was cold, undisturbed. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, tracing the small cracks in the plaster. They reminded me of veins. Or fault lines. Something waiting to split. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Dust hung in the air like fog, dancing in the shafts of light that came through the warped windows. I made coffee. 2 cups. Out of habit. I stood in the kitchen and looked at them, one steaming, the other untouched, and for a moment I didn't know which one was mine. I poured one out and took the other to the living room. He was already there. The nephew. Sitting on the floor, barefoot, surrounded by scattered sketchbooks and paintbrushes. He looked up as I entered, smiled, but said nothing. I offered him the cup without a word, and he took it, brushing my fingers again. The air between us wasn't charged or dramatic, just heavy. Like a curtain waiting to fall. I watched him flip through one of the sketchbooks, pages filled with lines and angles, fragments of the house, details I'd never noticed. The cracked corner of the fireplace. The light switch near the stairs. My hands. "I like studying what people ignore," he said. His voice was soft, almost careless. I wasn't sure if he meant to speak out loud. I didn't respond. Eventually, he looked at me again. "Would you mind sitting?" he asked, gesturing to the sofa. "Just for a quick sketch. I won't show anyone." I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to, but because I did. And that scared me. I sat down. He adjusted his angle, squinted one eye, then dipped his pencil into motion. I could hear the faint scratches on the paper. My breathing slowed. I was aware of everything, the way the cushion pressed against the back of my thighs, the way the neckline of my shirt dipped lower than I remembered, the warmth rising in my chest. He glanced up often, but never stared. His gaze was focused, deliberate, clinical, and yet it made my skin tingle. He wasn't looking at me the way my husband did. Or rather, the way my husband used to. He was seeing me, studying me. It was as if I'd become real again. I shifted slightly, and the hem of my dress slipped higher. He didn't flinch. He just kept sketching. And I didn't pull it down. A few minutes passed like that. Silent. Controlled. And then he put the pencil down. "You want to see?" he asked. I nodded. He turned the pad and held it out. My breath caught. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even detailed. But it was me, more me than I'd seen in years. There was softness in the lines, but strength too. My shoulders were squared, my chin slightly lifted. It wasn't how I looked. It was how I felt, or maybe how he saw me. I reached for the paper. Our fingers touched. We kissed. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't accidental. It happened the way rain starts, with a cloud you ignore until it opens above you. His lips were warm. The moment was brief. A heartbeat, maybe two. And then I pulled back. I stood. Quickly. My heart thudded, a dull drum behind my ribs. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I have to, I started, but didn't finish the sentence. I left the room, walked straight to the bathroom, and locked the door. Inside, I braced myself against the sink. My palms were clammy. I ran cold water and splashed my face. Stared into the mirror. The woman there was flushed, her pupils wide. She looked unfamiliar. Alive. That scared me more than anything. I sat on the toilet lid, fully dressed, trying to make sense of what just happened. My mind was chaos. But one truth cut through the noise: I didn't regret it. That terrified me. When I finally emerged, the living room was empty. The sketchbook lay closed on the coffee table. The air was still. I walked past it without looking, went upstairs, and changed clothes, into something looser, less suggestive. Not that it mattered now. I avoided him for the rest of the day. We worked in separate rooms. I stayed in the guest bedroom, organizing linens that didn't need organizing. He sanded the window frames. We didn't speak. Not really. Just murmurs, "Can you hand me that, or I'm going out for a bit." He left before dinner. I didn't ask where he went. I didn't eat. That night, I lay in bed fully clothed, blanket pulled up to my chest, heart pounding with every creak of the old floorboards. I didn't want him to come upstairs. But a small, silent part of me hoped he would. I hated that part. I thought of my husband. Of how we used to lie close on this same bed years ago. How his hand would find my hip in the dark. How he used to laugh in his sleep. I tried to remember the last time he looked at me the way the nephew did. I couldn't. At some point, I drifted off, haunted by the shape of that sketch. Haunted by what it meant. The next morning, I woke early. Dressed in silence. I went downstairs and saw that the sketchbook was gone. The nephew wasn't in sight. The coffee pot was warm. He'd made some already. I poured a cup and sat at the kitchen table, unsure of what would happen next, only certain that something had shifted and that we had crossed into unfamiliar territory. Whatever line we'd tiptoed before, we'd stepped over it. Quietly. Fully. And nothing would be the same. The morning began with the low hum of a lawnmower from a neighbor's yard down the hill, though we had no true neighbors here anymore. Just echoes from surrounding properties left half abandoned, like ours used to be. I sat in the kitchen alone, my fingers curled around the ceramic coffee cup, watching the dark liquid swirl each time I lifted it. My body still carried the static of yesterday, not from the kiss itself, but from everything unspoken that followed it. The quiet. The avoidance. The internal earthquake. He returned mid-morning, arms full of sandpaper, brushes, and something wrapped in brown paper. I didn't ask where he'd gone, and he didn't explain. He nodded at me, dropped everything by the staircase, and got to work without a word. It should have been awkward. It wasn't. It was heavy instead, like we were both holding something fragile between us and couldn't risk letting it drop. By mid-afternoon, my husband called. His voice crackled through the weak signal. I might have to stay overnight, he said. They pushed the supplier meeting to tomorrow. I answered with a simple okay, not asking for details. We both pretended this wasn't a pattern, that he hadn't begun sleeping better away from me than beside me. I hung up and stood in the center of the living room, the quiet swelling around me. Later, I found myself wiping down the old vanity in the upstairs hallway, the one with the small oval mirror that always made my reflection seem slightly distorted. My face looked longer, my eyes duller. Still, I kept glancing at it, searching. I wore a faded button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to my elbows, and a pair of soft cotton pants, nothing provocative, nothing deliberate. But it clung to me differently today. I couldn't explain how. He walked by once, carrying a bucket of joint compound and a mixing paddle. He nodded, barely pausing, but something in his glance lingered a breath too long. Or maybe I lingered in it. I didn't know anymore which one of us was leading. In the afternoon, we worked side by side, sanding old paneling in the guest room. The air filled with fine dust, catching in the slivers of light that pierced the worn blinds. I felt the tension even in the simplest movements, the stretch of my arm, the tilt of his body toward mine as he reached over for the extension cord. Neither of us spoke beyond practical comments. At one point, I bent down to plug something into the wall. When I stood up, he was close, not in a deliberate way, but near enough that I could feel the heat off his arm. We didn't move for a second. It was one of those moments that lingers not for what it is, but for what it could be. Then, as if waking from the same strange daze, we both shifted, returned to the task like nothing had passed between us. The silence resumed. But it wasn't the silence I used to fear. Not the cold, dismissive one I shared with my husband in recent years. This silence carried weight. Presence. Awareness. A mutual restraint that neither confirmed nor denied what had happened. After we finished the sanding, I went into the old master bedroom, a place I'd barely entered since we arrived. Dust lay across the furniture like untouched snow. The closet was still filled with mothballed jackets and brittle hangers. I opened one drawer and found a stack of yellowed photos, his parents smiling on the porch, a child with a fishing pole, an old Thanksgiving dinner where everyone looked slightly overdressed and half-bored. I couldn't remember the last time my husband had told me anything about his childhood. I closed the drawer and leaned against the dresser. My hands trembled lightly, not from fatigue, but from the slow unraveling of everything familiar. It was like standing at the edge of a high dive, not knowing if the water below was deep enough, but also not caring. In the late afternoon, he found me in the kitchen, bent over the sink, washing out paintbrushes. He placed something on the table behind me. I didn't turn immediately. "It's for you," he said quietly. I turned. The brown paper he'd carried earlier now wrapped a frame. Inside was the sketch. The one from yesterday. Mounted on a simple backing, no glass, no pretense. Just the drawing. Just me. My breath caught in my chest. I couldn't speak. He didn't push me to. I thought you should have it, he said, his voice steady but low. Then he left the room. I stood there, staring at it. The lines, though faint and imprecise, captured something raw in my posture, a softness I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't posing. I looked open. Vulnerable. Real. Later, I carried it upstairs and slid it into the back of the closet beneath a pile of old bed linens. I didn't know why I hid it. Only that I couldn't bear for it to be seen, not by my husband, not even by me, not yet. That night, after dinner, we sat on the porch in silence. The sunset painted the sky in slow, streaked oranges. He sat on the steps, arms resting on his knees. I stayed in the rocking chair, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The air between us was full of the things we wouldn't say. A breeze passed. Leaves rustled. He finally broke the quiet. This place, it makes you remember things you didn't know you missed. I nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. Or things you tried to forget. We didn't look at each other after that. When the sun was gone, and the night took over the yard in slow stretches, we stood up at the same time, without a word. He turned toward the guest room. I toward the stairs. But before I reached the top, I paused. I felt the weight of everything in my chest, the portrait hidden in the closet, the warmth of the morning coffee, the moment we shared that now sat like a stone under my ribs. Something had begun, and I wasn't sure I could stop it. I wasn't even sure I wanted to. But tomorrow would come. It always did. And I had no idea what it would bring. The following day unfolded with a strange kind of stillness, as though the house itself had become cautious of making noise. The wooden floors creaked softer, the breeze through the cracked windows gentler. I moved through the rooms quietly, listening for footsteps that never came, for voices that weren't there. My husband's absence no longer felt temporary, it felt normal. A default state. I began the morning by organizing the paint supplies left in the corner of the front room. I didn't need to. Everything was already neatly stacked, but I needed something repetitive to do with my hands. I wiped cans that didn't need wiping. Peeled off labels just to discard them. Anything to avoid thinking. But thinking found me anyway. Every time I turned, every time I paused for breath, I felt it again, an ache somewhere between guilt and hunger. It wasn't about the kiss. It was about everything it opened. Doors I had sealed shut long ago with promises, with routines, with years of silent compromise. I didn't hear him approach. He stood in the doorway with his sleeves rolled up and a half-empty glass in his hand. His eyes didn't search me the way they had before. They settled, quiet and cautious. "We should finish the hallway," he said. Just that. No mention of yesterday. No tone. Just direction. I nodded. The hallway walls were half-stripped, layers of old wallpaper curling like dried leaves. The pattern underneath was even older, yellowed and faded, a design someone once loved and later covered. I traced a flower with my finger, imagining the hands that had hung it decades ago. We worked side by side. No music. No small talk. The rhythm of our tools filled the silence, scrape, pull, peel. It should have been mundane. But there was a gravity in our movements, a shared sense of careful control. We moved with intention, never touching, never overlapping, like dancers keeping to parallel lines. At one point, I climbed the step stool to reach a strip near the ceiling. He steadied the base without being asked. His hand rested lightly against the side, not on me, but close enough that I could feel the air between us shift. I didn't look down. I didn't thank him. I spent most of the day avoiding eye contact, not because I feared what I'd see, but because I feared what I wouldn't be able to hide. My emotions had become unpredictable. They moved through me like summer storms, sudden, loud, impossible to ignore. After lunch, we took separate breaks. I sat alone on the porch, the mug of tea cooling in my hands. The sky was pale, clouds drifting slowly, disinterested in what lay beneath them. I wondered if anyone outside this property had any idea what was happening inside it. I doubted it. The world was too busy to notice these kinds of quiet implosions. When I went back inside, he was kneeling in the hallway, applying primer to a corner where the plaster had been repaired. He didn't glance up when I passed. I stood behind him for a second too long, then continued on. It felt like we were trapped in a story neither of us knew how to write, with no clear villain, no clear hero, just choices. Mid-afternoon, the rain came suddenly. Not heavy, but enough to coat the windows and fill the air with that scent of wet earth. I watched it from the upstairs window, arms crossed over my chest. For a moment, I remembered how we used to dance in the rain years ago, when we were still new, still untangled. My husband and I. We'd come to places like this and laugh over wine, let ourselves be pulled into summer storms barefoot, dripping, young. I tried to hold on to the memory, but it slipped too easily from my grip. Later, I found myself in the old study, the room we hadn't touched yet. The walls still bore a dusty maroon hue, and the bookshelves sagged with forgotten hardbacks. I ran a hand across the spines, stopping on one with no title. When I pulled it out, a sheet of paper fluttered to the ground. It was a list. In his father's handwriting, I guessed. Tasks to do. Fix leak in back room. Repaint shutters. Replace attic bulb. It was dated nearly 20 years ago. None of the items had been checked off. I held the list like a relic, an echo of another couple who once thought time was endless. I folded it gently and slid it into my pocket. By dusk, the rain had stopped, and the nephew was outside again, clearing branches that had fallen in the wind. I watched him from the upstairs window for a long time before going down. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, just as he looked up. He didn't wave. I didn't smile. But he walked toward me. Storm didn't do much damage, he said. I nodded. The gutters are holding better than I expected. A pause. You've changed the place more than anyone, I said after a while. His gaze met mine. I'm not sure that's true. It is, I replied, and I meant more than just the walls and ceilings. Another pause. I should probably head out soon, he said. Take a few days back in the city. Let you two settle in. My breath caught. Not at the thought of him leaving, but at the reason behind it. I didn't ask for this, I said, my voice quiet, almost a whisper. I know. We stood in the dying light, the dampness of the porch boards seeping through the soles of my shoes. The moment stretched, tense and unfinished, and then we both turned away at the same time. We didn't say goodnight. Back in my room, I opened the closet and pulled out the hidden sketch. I stared at it under the dim light of the bedside lamp. The lines had not changed. But I had. I tucked it back beneath the linens and shut the door. The hallway was dark when I stepped into it. I paused at the guest room door. His light was off. I considered knocking. I considered walking past. In the end, I did neither. I turned around, went back into my room, and lay in the silence. There were too many things I didn't know how to say. And too many I couldn't take back once said. Tomorrow would bring more work. More peeling. More coats of paint to cover what had been. But not everything could be covered. Not everything should be. The morning arrived heavy with humidity, the kind that clings to the skin before the sun has even fully risen. I stepped onto the back porch with my coffee and immediately felt it, the weight of the air, the quiet of the yard, the absence of any breeze. It reminded me of the hours before a thunderstorm. Still, too still. He was already outside, near the tool shed, fixing a broken latch with a screwdriver. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat, and his hair stuck to his forehead. I watched him for a few seconds too long before he looked up. He gave me a quick nod, polite, distant, and returned to work. No words. We were both pretending well this morning. I returned inside and forced myself to begin cleaning the upstairs closet. My husband had asked days ago if I could sort through the linens and toss what was too far gone. At the time, I hadn't responded. But today, I needed a task that felt harmless. Predictable. Mechanical. The scent of mothballs filled the room as I pulled out old sheets and folded blankets. My hands moved without thought, but my mind wandered. It wandered back to the kiss, how brief it had been, how undeniable. I hadn't spoken to him about it. Neither of us had. And yet, every glance, every silence between us now carried that memory like a second presence in the room. I tried to remind myself that it meant nothing. That it could mean nothing if I chose. But some part of me, the part I'd long buried under years of restraint, stirred restlessly every time I recalled it. It wasn't the physical act that haunted me. It was how right it had felt in the moment. How I hadn't wanted to pull away. The sound of a door slamming brought me back to the present. I peered out the window and saw him heading toward the main house, wiping his hands on a rag. A few minutes later, he passed the bedroom where I worked. He paused in the doorway. Not fully entering. Just standing there. Need help with anything? He asked. I shook my head, too quickly. No. I've got it. He nodded once, then stepped back into the hallway. The floor creaked faintly under his weight. I waited until his footsteps faded before returning to the pile in front of me. Later, I found myself scrubbing the floor of the downstairs hallway. I had no reason to. It was already clean. But I needed to move. I needed to sweat. To distract myself from the tightness in my chest that wouldn't go away. By early afternoon, the sky had turned a pale, sickly gray. The air felt electric. A storm was coming, though the forecast hadn't mentioned one. I stepped out onto the porch just as the first drops began to fall. Fat, slow ones that darkened the wood beneath my feet. He appeared beside me moments later, carrying a folding chair. He didn't look at me as he sat. I didn't speak as I leaned against the railing. The rain came harder, a sudden curtain of water slicing across the yard. The sound was deafening, a roar against the roof and trees. We sat in silence, watching the world blur. Then he spoke. I'm leaving tomorrow. I turned to him, startled. His expression was unreadable. Back to the city, he added. I looked away. My throat tightened. For how long? He shrugged. Maybe for good. I think it's better. I didn't answer. I wanted to say something, to ask why now, or if it was because of me. But the words felt too fragile. Too dangerous. Instead, I stood and stepped back into the house. I went straight to the dining room, grabbed the rag I'd left earlier, and began wiping the already clean table. My hands moved in tight circles. My heart pounded. The door creaked. I heard his steps approach. I didn't mean to make this harder, he said quietly behind me. Still, I didn't turn. I know, I replied. There was a pause. Then he stepped closer. I felt him behind me, the heat of him, the quiet weight of his presence. The room felt impossibly small. I turned. We kissed. It happened without ceremony, without build-up. As natural as breathing. As inevitable as the storm outside. We kissed, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Then I stepped back. My hands trembled at my sides. I couldn't meet his eyes. I shouldn't have. I know, he interrupted. Me neither. We stood there, the moment stretching between us like a rope about to snap. Then I left the room. I didn't run. I walked, calmly, upstairs to the bathroom and locked the door behind me. I braced my hands on the sink and stared at myself in the mirror. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I just stood there, breathing hard, watching the woman in the reflection try to decide who she was now. Later, when I emerged, he was gone from the hallway. The dining room was empty. The rain had stopped. The sketch he'd given me, the one I'd hidden beneath the linens, had been placed gently on my bed. He must have retrieved it from the closet. It sat there, silent, waiting. I sat beside it and traced the edge of the frame with my finger. I didn't lift it. I didn't move it. I just stared. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house groaned and shifted with the cooling air. Every sound felt sharper. Every shadow darker. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between thunder and silence. I had crossed a line. We both had. And there was no going back. The morning after the storm was cool and unusually bright, as if the air had been scrubbed clean during the night. I woke early, before the birds had fully found their rhythm. The house was still, resting in a kind of reluctant peace, like even the walls were holding their breath. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, not moving, barely blinking, letting the silence soak in before the weight of the day returned. He was supposed to leave. He'd said it yesterday. But I didn't know if he had packed, if the decision was final, or if it had simply been a way to end a conversation neither of us had the courage to finish. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. The pot of coffee had been started though, and I poured myself a cup without thinking. The mug warmed my fingers, but I didn't drink. I stood by the window above the sink, watching the sun cut through the last of the puddles on the back porch, listening to the tick of the wall clock and the sound of my own shallow breath. I wondered if he was still in the guest room or already gone. The not knowing pressed hard against my chest. I carried the coffee to the dining room and sat in the same chair I always did, facing the window, the frame he had returned to my bed still sitting on the far corner of the table. I didn't touch it. Mid-morning drifted in. I heard footsteps upstairs, deliberate, heavy. Still here. Not yet gone. A few minutes later, he appeared in the hallway with a small duffel bag over one shoulder. I remained seated. He didn't say anything right away. Just looked at me like he wasn't sure what version of me he'd be speaking to. I need to head out soon, he said, his voice low and neutral. I nodded, eyes fixed on the window. I'll leave the ladder and sander here, in case he wants to keep working when he's back. Okay, I said. Another pause. I didn't mean for any of this. I closed my eyes briefly. I wanted to scream, to say something sharp and final. But all I could manage was a quiet, I know. He turned to leave, then hesitated. I'm sorry. When the door finally closed behind him, I stayed seated. The silence that followed was louder than his presence had ever been. I sat there until the coffee turned cold, until the sun moved across the floor in long, golden stripes, until the emptiness around me felt bigger than the house itself. In the afternoon, I wandered through the rooms without purpose. I passed each doorway slowly, pausing in thresholds like I expected the walls to speak. In the hallway, I ran my fingers along the freshly primed walls, their surface smooth and pale. They felt nothing like the ones I'd grown up pressing my back against when I needed a moment alone. These were new walls. But they held old mistakes now. I returned to the guest room. His scent still lingered faintly on the pillowcases, a mixture of sawdust and soap. I changed the sheets mechanically, folding them into a pile, smoothing corners with fingers that no longer shook. It felt like I was preparing the room for someone else, a stranger. It felt like a goodbye I didn't get to say properly. Outside, the wind picked up. I watched it move through the trees, stirring leaves without direction. I opened the window slightly, letting the breeze in. It brought no relief. Later, I went into town to pick up groceries. I drove without turning on the radio, letting the silence stretch with me down each empty road. I walked the aisles of the store with a detached kind of focus, selecting things I didn't really need, scanning items absent-mindedly. At checkout, the woman behind the counter asked how the renovations were going. I told her we were making progress. When I returned home, I placed the bags on the counter and stood there, not unpacking. The house felt even quieter now. Not just from his absence, but because of the part of me he'd taken with him. That night, I prepared dinner though I wasn't hungry. I cooked enough for two, out of habit. I set 2 plates. Poured 2 glasses of wine. I sat down and stared across the table at the empty chair, the untouched plate, the framed sketch he'd left behind. I didn't cry. I didn't eat. Eventually, I carried the dishes to the sink, poured the wine down the drain, and put the food in the refrigerator. I turned off the lights room by room, letting the darkness catch up behind me. Before bed, I found myself on the back porch again. The sky was clear. Stars poked through the velvet above in quiet constellations. The air was cooler, sharper. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat down, folding my knees up to my chest. I thought about how we had all arrived at this house expecting to fix things, the stairs, the plaster, the roof. But no one had considered the people living under it. We brought our broken selves here thinking renovation was something that could be done with tools and measurements. But some fractures don't show on walls. They hide inside choices. And once you make one, even a small one, the next becomes easier. And then the one after that. I stayed on the porch for a long time, watching the shadows shift and stretch, letting the cold seep in around my ankles. I wasn't sure what would come next. But something already had. And I couldn't take it back. The following morning arrived with an eerie stillness. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that settles right before something breaks. I knew it the moment I opened my eyes. There was a shift in the air, a pressure I couldn't name, like something waiting to be discovered. I lay in bed longer than usual, my arms folded over my chest, the covers twisted around my legs. The house creaked lightly, windless, soundless. When I finally forced myself to rise, I moved through the motions of my morning in silence. Washed my face, brushed my teeth, avoided my reflection. The coffee brewed slower than it should have, or maybe I was just too aware of time. I stood by the counter, fingers drumming against the rim of the mug, thinking of nothing and everything. My husband was expected to return today. He hadn't called. That in itself wasn't surprising, he rarely felt the need, but today, it felt heavy. Everything did. I spent the morning folding laundry, sorting nails into jars, wiping surfaces that didn't need wiping. There was a hollow rhythm to the day, like I was rehearsing a life I hadn't fully returned to. The house, so full just days ago, now felt unfamiliar again. Roomy in the wrong places, echoing in corners I'd forgotten. By noon, I moved outside. The backyard was littered with damp leaves, still soggy from the recent rain. I gathered them into piles with a wide-bristled rake, dragging them toward the compost bin. The labor was comforting, mindless, grounding. I needed grounding. I was halfway through clearing the path to the tool shed when I heard it. A sharp clap, not thunder, not wind. A gate? A door? I turned and saw a figure at the side of the house. It was my husband's friend. He hadn't told me he was coming. He was dressed as he always was, button-down rolled at the sleeves, jeans, a clipboard under one arm. He moved with ease, like he'd done this 100 times. And maybe he had. Just not like this. Didn't mean to startle you, he said, his tone casual. I nodded, wiping my palms on my thighs. Wasn't expecting anyone. He smiled faintly, glanced around. Came to drop off the contractor forms. He said you might need them. I stepped aside and gestured toward the porch. Come in. We sat at the patio table, a thin layer of dust gathering at the corners. He set the papers down and pulled out a pen, flipping through pages with quiet efficiency. I watched his hands. Broad, careful. Steady. After a few minutes, he looked up. Place looks different. Cleaner. I nodded. We've been working on it. We? His nephew helped. You met him, right? His eyes lingered on mine for a second too long. Briefly. I shifted in my seat. He was a big help, I added, trying to keep my voice level. He left yesterday. Another pause. He clicked his pen twice, slowly, then set it down. I was here the other afternoon, he said, his tone lighter than it should have been. Came by to drop something off. You were in the backyard. I didn't want to interrupt. My chest tightened. I could hear the blood rush in my ears. I waited, willing myself not to move, not to speak first. His eyes didn't leave mine. I saw him, he said finally. Saw you both. The silence between us turned solid. Not brittle. Heavy. He didn't look accusatory. Just tired. Observant. As though he had seen more than he should have and didn't know what to do with it. I tried to find something to say. Anything that would break the stillness, explain it away, make it lighter. But there was nothing light left in me. So I said the only true thing I could, I know. He nodded once. It's not my business. It isn't, I agreed, though it was already too late for that to matter. He gathered the papers, clipped them back together with deliberate precision. When he stood, he hesitated before speaking again. He'll be back today. I know. If he asks. I won't say anything. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. He walked down the steps, hands in his pockets, and disappeared around the side of the house without another word. I sat there long after he'd gone, my pulse slowly settling. My breath was shallow, my hands cold. So it was done. Someone knew. Someone besides me. That changed everything, even if no one ever spoke of it again. I went back inside and paced the hallway, touching the walls we'd worked on together, the ones still unfinished. I found myself in the guest room, standing beside the made bed, staring at the indentation left in the pillow where his head had rested. I smoothed it with one hand and then sat on the edge of the bed, folding forward until my hands touched the floor. It wasn't regret I felt. It wasn't even guilt. It was the recognition that everything had shifted. A before and after had been carved into my life, clean, precise, undeniable. I stayed like that for a long time, breathing against my knees, until I heard the low hum of tires on gravel. My husband was back. I rose slowly, pressed my palms against my cheeks, and went to the front door. His car door slammed. I watched him emerge, stretch his arms, squint at the sky. He waved absently when he saw me and made his way toward the porch, talking before he'd even reached the steps. Something about delays and receipts and needing a drink. I nodded at the right times, answered with small phrases, smiled in all the expected places. He kissed my cheek and stepped inside. The air around me pulsed with silence again, but now it was laced with something else. Witness. Consequence. I stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, unsure whether I felt more relief or dread. Because now it wasn't just mine to carry. Now, someone else knew. And knowing is a weight that never really leaves. The days that followed blurred into one another, each carrying the same gray weight. My husband returned fully to the house and the project, as if no time had passed, as if the silence that waited behind every corner was just the sound of old wood settling. He asked questions about the work that had been done, complimented the progress, even joked that we'd finally turned the place into something livable. I nodded along. I answered when asked. I smiled at the right times. But inside, something shifted. I had become a spectator in my own life, watching myself from across a narrow hallway, through windows smudged by memory. He didn't notice. He rarely noticed anything he wasn't already expecting. I spent more and more time in the garden. There wasn't much growing there yet, mostly weeds, overgrowth, scattered remnants of what must have once been flower beds. But I liked the dirt on my hands. I liked the way it grounded me, how pulling at stubborn roots gave me something to wrestle with that wasn't invisible. One afternoon, while I was kneeling by the back fence, brushing aside loose gravel and dead leaves, I heard footsteps approaching. Not the rushed kind that come with excitement. These were slow, deliberate. I didn't look up. My husband crouched beside me. I felt his presence before I saw it. He set down a watering can I hadn't realized he was holding. "Thought you might need this," he said. "Thanks," I replied, brushing my hands against my thighs. We stayed like that for a while, both facing the garden bed, both pretending to see something growing where there was only soil. "You've been quiet lately," he said after a pause. I turned slightly. "Have I?" He gave a half shrug, the kind that meant he didn't want a real answer. "Just an observation." I nodded once and returned my attention to the dirt. "I've been thinking," he said, "once this place is done, we should rent it out. Could make a little extra each month." I didn't answer. "Or sell it, if the market's right. We could use that money for the new kitchen at home." Still, I didn't respond. I pressed my palm into the earth, fingers spread wide, letting the chill seep into my skin. He sighed and stood, brushing the back of his jeans. "Just think about it," he said as he walked back toward the house. I remained in the garden until the light began to fade, long after the air had turned cool. I didn't want to go back inside. That evening, I sat on the porch alone while he watched a game in the living room. I could hear the buzz of the commentators, the rise and fall of their excitement, and occasionally, the muffled sound of my husband's voice reacting, laughing at something I didn't understand. The sketch still lay upstairs, tucked behind the linens in the closet. I hadn't looked at it since that night. But it hadn't left my mind. The memory of the lines, the angles, the version of me it had captured, or imagined, lingered like a shadow at the edge of every moment. I thought of the friend. I wondered if he'd tell. If he already had. But nothing changed. My husband remained as he had been, predictable, steady, distracted. If something had been said, it had settled somewhere between them unspoken. The next morning, I woke early. I walked down the hall barefoot, careful not to wake him. I stopped at the guest room. The bed was still made. The closet empty. As if he had never been there at all. I pushed the door open and stood in the center of the room, letting the quiet settle around me. My hands trembled slightly. I didn't know why. The house was too clean. Too still. I returned to the master bedroom and stood in front of the mirror. I examined my face, the fine lines, the way my eyes seemed tired even after sleep. I touched my collarbone, the slope of my shoulder, as if checking that I still existed beneath the surface. Later that day, my husband asked if I wanted to drive into town with him. Pick up some supplies. Maybe grab lunch. I said no. He didn't push. He never did. When he left, I went into the kitchen and opened the back window. The breeze felt good. Honest. I leaned on the windowsill and stared into the distance, the fields beyond the fence swaying gently in the wind. I stayed like that for a long time. By mid-afternoon, the friend returned. He knocked once and stepped back, waiting. I opened the door slowly, uncertain of what to say, of what he might be bringing with him. I came to drop off the receipts, he said, holding out an envelope. I took it, nodded. Thanks. He hesitated. Everything okay? Yes, I said, too quickly. He paused. I hope you're all right. I am, I replied, though I wasn't sure it was true. He started to turn, then looked back. He doesn't know, he said quietly. I met his eyes. But you do. He nodded. Then he left. I stood in the doorway long after he was gone, the envelope still in my hand, the weight of it suddenly disproportionate. That night, my husband returned later than expected. He brought food, cheap takeout in noisy paper bags. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, eating in silence, the kind that feels like a performance. He asked how my day was. I said it was fine. He told me about a sale on flooring. I nodded. We moved through the meal like actors hitting their marks. Later, in bed, he reached for me under the covers. His hand touched my hip, tentative, unsure. I didn't move away, but I didn't move closer either. We stayed like that for a while, neither of us saying anything. Eventually, he rolled onto his back and fell asleep. I stared at the ceiling, the dark pressing down like a second skin. The house creaked. The wind rattled the shutters. And I lay there, trying to remember who I had been before all this began. Before the house. Before the kiss. Before the truth I now carried like a stone at the base of my spine. There was no answer. Only the slow awareness that something inside me had shifted irreversibly. And that no one, not even I, could undo it. The days grew shorter. The light in the house began to change, fading earlier in the corners of the rooms, making the spaces feel smaller, more enclosed. I noticed how shadows stayed longer in the stairwell and how the air inside cooled before the sun even touched the horizon. The season was shifting, subtly but undeniably. And with it, so was something in me. The renovations slowed. Not because there was less to do, but because my husband grew distracted. He started talking more often about the house as a project, something to finish and move on from, not something to live in. He made lists in the evenings, sitting at the dining table, flipping through brochures for tiles and faucets, discussing costs out loud even when I wasn't listening. I said little. I existed in the periphery, occupying the same rooms but in a different rhythm. I wasn't needed in decisions anymore. He had fallen back into his old patterns, taking control, solving, optimizing, assuming silence meant agreement. For most of our marriage, it had. One evening, after a long day of rearranging the attic and boxing up old kitchenware, I took the sketch from the closet. I hadn't looked at it in weeks. It was still framed, still intact. I brought it down to the dining room and placed it on the table where the old flower vase used to sit. My husband didn't notice it at first. He walked past it twice, talking on the phone, rifling through papers. Only after he hung up did he pause. "Where did this come from?" he asked. I looked up from where I stood by the stove. "It was a gift," I said. He picked it up, turned it slightly, examining the lines. "You don't usually keep things like this out." I wiped my hands on a towel. "Maybe that's the problem." He didn't respond. just set the frame back down and returned to his papers. The conversation ended there, like most of ours did now, open-ended, unresolved. Later that night, after he'd gone to bed, I stayed downstairs with a glass of water in hand. The house was quiet except for the low ticking of the wall clock. I stood by the window, staring out into the backyard where the toolshed sat, its door half ajar, forgotten. I thought about the moment in the hallway, when his nephew had steadied the stool I was standing on. I remembered how my breath had caught, not from fear of falling but from the nearness of someone actually looking up at me, paying attention. That moment felt like years ago now. And yet it pulsed just beneath my skin, raw and present. The next day, my husband suggested we invite a few people out for a small dinner to see the progress. A kind of soft reopening for a home that had long been in pieces. He offered to call his friend and a few of the neighbors. I nodded. I didn't want guests. But I also didn't have the energy to explain why. That afternoon, I cleaned every room slowly, carefully. I polished the wood surfaces, dusted the bookshelves, arranged the throw pillows like it mattered. It didn't. But I needed something to finish. Something I could control. When his friend arrived, the one who knew, I felt it immediately. The shift in air. The weight of unspoken memory. He greeted us both like nothing had happened, his voice steady, his handshake firm. But I saw it in the way he looked at me. Not accusation. Not pity. Just understanding. We sat outside, the table set with wine glasses and store-bought desserts. Laughter filled the porch. The sun dipped low, casting long lines across the lawn. My husband told stories about the renovation, about things that had gone wrong, things that had come together. He mentioned his nephew only once, briefly, calling him a good help. I felt my body still at that moment. I looked at the friend. He looked at his glass. No one said anything more. As the evening drew on, the friend helped me bring in dishes while my husband stayed on the porch finishing his wine. We moved around the kitchen in silence until I finally spoke. "Thank you," I said, without turning to look at him. "For what?" he asked, though he knew. "For not saying anything." He placed the plate in the sink. "It's not mine to say." I nodded. We didn't speak again that night. Later, after everyone had gone, and my husband had gone to bed, I walked through the house in the dark, letting my fingers drag along the surfaces, the table, the banister, the door frames. I ended up in the guest room again. I stood there for a long time, staring at the bed, the empty space where a suitcase had once been. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my hands folded in my lap. I remembered everything. The weight of his gaze. The softness of his voice. The moment in the rain. The silence that followed. I didn't know what I expected to feel. Regret, maybe. Or longing. But what I felt instead was something colder. The permanence of a choice. The cost of it, slow and quiet. Eventually, I stood, turned off the light, and walked back to our bedroom. My husband was asleep. I lay down beside him and stared at the ceiling, my hands resting on my stomach. The air in the room felt too still. The ceiling too close. Somewhere outside, a bird cried once into the night, then fell silent again. And I knew, the truth didn't always need to be spoken aloud to become real. It just needed to be lived with. Day after day. Breath after breath. And I was still breathing. The last weeks in the house unfolded like a slow unspooling of thread, each day slipping past without shape or ceremony. There was no dramatic ending, no confrontation, no sudden collapse. Just a steady settling into the consequences of every choice made, mine, his, all of ours. I felt it everywhere, in the dust that gathered on untouched surfaces, in the way the light fractured through the old window panes, in the heaviness of the air before rain. I moved through the house as though inhabiting the memory of my own life, careful not to disturb what had settled, afraid to call anything new into being. My husband finished the last bits of renovation, painting the door frames, installing new hardware, caulking the seams where plaster met wood. He moved with a focus I recognized, the need to finish, to put things in order, to give the appearance of closure even when none was possible. We spoke less. Not out of anger, but out of habit. Our words were functional, pared down to necessities. Do you need help with that? I'll be back late. Can you pass me the wrench? There was no longer an expectation of more. I found comfort in the routines, in the way each day offered its own small tasks. In the mornings, I swept the kitchen, then walked through the garden, running my fingers over the last yellowing leaves before autumn truly set in. I tried to let the crisp air fill my lungs, tried to believe that change could happen in the body even if it didn't happen in the heart. Some nights, I lay awake and traced the ceiling's old cracks with my eyes. I listened to my husband's breath, steady, oblivious, and tried to imagine what it would be like to tell him everything. To drag all that was hidden into the light. But I never did. The urge would rise, peak, and then fade, leaving only a dull ache behind. I told myself it was mercy. Maybe it was fear. The sketch remained on the dining room table for a few days before I quietly tucked it into a drawer. I couldn't bear to look at it anymore, but I also couldn't throw it away. It was proof, not of what had happened, but of what I had allowed to change in myself. I kept it, and it kept me honest in ways words never could. When my husband finally announced we were done, really done, he was almost cheerful. He took pictures of the finished rooms and sent them to friends. He made plans to list the house, debated the best time to sell. He joked about finally being able to rest. We invited the friend one last time, for a final dinner. The meal was simple, roasted vegetables, bread, a bottle of wine saved for a special occasion. We ate on the porch, wrapped in sweaters against the cooling air. The conversation was easy, almost kind. No one mentioned the past, or the work it had taken to get here. We let silence fall where it needed to, filling the gaps with shared glances and small, honest smiles. After the meal, the friend lingered behind while my husband went inside to take a call. He stood at the edge of the porch, hands in his pockets, looking out at the yard. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer for a long time. I let the question hang in the darkness between us. "I don't know," I said at last. "But I will be." He nodded, understanding something I couldn't name, and then he left. The house emptied quickly after that. We packed boxes and stacked them in the entryway. My husband managed the movers. I cleaned behind him, erasing the last traces of our presence with a cloth and a bucket of soapy water. On the final morning, I walked from room to room, touching each doorframe, each wall, saying a silent goodbye to all the versions of myself I had been in these spaces. I stood for a long time in the guest room, the bed stripped bare, sunlight pooling on the floor. I let the quiet wash over me. Outside, my husband called my name. The car was loaded. The house was empty. I stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind me. The lock turned with a soft click, final and quiet. We drove away in silence, the road curling behind us, the house shrinking until it was just another shape in the landscape. My husband's hand rested on the wheel, his eyes fixed ahead. I leaned my head against the glass and let the landscape blur by. I didn't know where we were going next. I only knew that the part of me that had broken in that house would always remain there, a silent truth stitched into its walls. But I also knew, finally, that I could carry on. And so I did.